Since 1877, in the Boston Public Garden, members of the Paget family have been peddling people around the pond in boats inspired by the Swan Boat from the opera Lohengrin. In the spring of the year, mother mallards show off their ducklings. There's a story about ducklings in the public garden, a true story that Robert McCloskey turned into a children's book in 1941. It's a story about a mother duck who brought her brood of 8 ducklings up from the Charles River to live in the public garden. And today, by the entrance to the garden, bronze statues of that mother and her brood welcome each new generation of children who come to celebrate this timeless tale. East of the public garden is the Boston Common, where colonial Bostonians used to graze their cows. At the top of the garden is the new State House, designed in 1798 by Charles Bulfinch, architect of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. And behind the State House is the exclusive residential area of Beacon Hill, developed in the early 1800s, including a number of houses designed by Bulfinch. Southwest of the public garden, past the Arlington Street Church and next to Trinity Church, is the 60-story John Hancock building designed by I.M. Pei. From the observatory on the top, we can look back down on the public garden and out over the city of Boston. Across the Charles River is Cambridge and MIT. Down on the river are the racing crews practicing here in front of Harvard University. The Charles River flows out into Boston Harbor. Straight ahead of us on the shore is the Fennel Hall Marketplace. In the middle of the marketplace are the buildings of the Quincy Market, built in 1825. Now, this whole area has been recently restored. The first English settlements were here on the coast at Plymouth, Salem, and Boston, and we'll have a look at those shortly, and then we'll follow the colonists down into Rhode Island, over into Connecticut. Then we'll follow the Connecticut River up through western Massachusetts into Vermont. Then we'll cross the Connecticut River into New Hampshire and conclude our exploration of New England in the state of Maine. But before we go back into the past, Let's have a look at the modern Massachusetts seacoast. First, at Cape Ann, and then down at Cape Cod. The tourist center of Cape Ann is at Rockport. This building, known as Motif No. 1, is reputed to have been painted by more artists than any other building in the country. At the foot of Cape Cod, on the Massachusetts mainland, the land is pitted with cranberry bogs. The cranberry is a Native American plant, and cranberries are Massachusetts' largest export crop. At harvest time, these cranberry bogs are flooded, and it takes several hours to pump enough water into one of these bogs to flood it. When the water is deep enough, then a beater is brought into the bog, and this beater separates the cranberries from the vines. That machine up there on the shore sucks the cranberries up out of the pond. It's kind of like a vacuum cleaner. The hose runs down into the pond and up underneath, and right there under the water is the end of the hose sucking those cranberries in. This machine separates the berries from the vines and the chaff. Berries that are harvested this way are made into cranberry juice and cranberry sauce. But the berries you buy in the store whole are harvested by a dry method, using these tiny little harvesting machines. Well, you cannot drive a truck across these boggy bogs, so the helicopter comes in and picks up the crates full of the harvested berries and carries them back and places them on the trucks. A few miles from the cranberry bogs is one of New England's favorite vacation lands, Cape Cod, with its endless sunny beaches. But it isn't always sunny on Cape Cod, but it is always fun to be at the beach. Our history of New England begins on Cape Cod in November, the 11th day of the month, the year 1620. 102 people on a small ship heading for Virginia but apparently blown off course by a storm, make a landfall in this shallow harbor near the site of the present city of Provincetown. The Pilgrims had landed in New England. They lowered their small boat, called a shallop, and explored Cape Cod for 5 weeks. Deciding that this was not a hospitable place to settle, they sailed off across Cape Cod Bay to make their famous, if perhaps mythical, landing on Plymouth Rock, today ensconced in a Greek temple. They moored the Mayflower near the shore, where today a reconstructed Mayflower II is berthed. That first winter, the winter of 1620-1621, most of the Pilgrims lived on this tiny ship, and about half of the group died. With the spring, they began to build their settlement on shore, retaining the name Plymouth given to the place by Captain John Smith some years before. Their simple dwellings were made of sawn timber with thatched roofs, much like the simple dwellings of England of the time. The first couple of years were hard, but the Indians were friendly and taught the colonists how to plant Indian corn and other native vegetables, and soon the colony prospered. Today, just south of the present town of Plymouth, Plymouth Plantation has been built as a very carefully researched reconstruction of the colony as it was in 1627. Each of the people of Plymouth Plantation plays the role of one of the colonists, learning the accents of 17th century England from the place from which he or she had come. Master Edward Winslow is in his cottage reading from his Geneva Bible, and he pauses a moment to talk with us.
Well, as to the furniture, the larger pieces as press cupboards and bedsteads and are more brought over after the first year. Let you remark that some of them are fair pieces. Perhaps it is the plainness of the cottage that we have only been here such a short time that really makes the pieces look so much finer than they really are. These are not uncommon furnishings to what we would have in England. You will find here that although our cottages are more common and mean, that we are actually men of the middling sort, and that we, of course, do dress to our station. Thus, that we are in a wilderness means not that we lay aside our fashion. Perhaps it is even more important that we keep our fashions as we would have, be that we dwell in England or here.
At the top of the village was their largest building, a combination fort, meeting house, and church. The core group of the Pilgrims were religious separatists. They wanted to separate from the Church of England, but that was not allowed in England, so first they went to Holland, and then they decided to come to America to found their own church and society here. Visitors to the Plymouth Plantation can discourse with the colonists on subjects of religion or other matters. Red-bearded Isaac Allerton has just returned from England, where he negotiated repayment of the debt owed by the colonists to the men who had financed the Plymouth colony. A few of these farm animals were brought over in the crowded Mayflower. However, most of them came over in later years on subsequent ships. The cooper was John Alden. He had signed on as a crew member on the Mayflower, but when he got to Plymouth, he decided to stay, to make the barrels that would be required to store liquids and dry products. Here in his tiny one-room cottage are his materials, his tools, and his workshop, where the bedding, which is spread out on the floor at night, is piled up by day to make workspace. John Alden's wife, Priscilla Mullins Alden, is preparing a rabbit for their dinner.
'Tis a good fat coney what I do cook this day, a rabbit what hath grown, that is what it is. Mine husband hath caught it in a snare, for it doth go within my garden and favour to eat upon the herbs what I have planted. That I put a good belly pudding within it of Injun corn, and some dried fruit and divers herbs from my garden. Have taken and ground up the Injun corn, so it be very fine. It is not so fit bread, but doth make a very good pudding. that it is dried fruits certainly do come from England, for there is no good supply of them here. Also, I put some eggs to it, and some pepper, and some salt, and herbs such as some lovage, and some sage, and some parsley, and put within the belly. It shall be a fair good belly pudding, aye, for that's what it is. Shall roast for the better part of the morning's time, and I shall draw forth coals from the back of my hearth where there's a good blaze burning. It shall take perhaps 2 or 3 hours' time, I would warrant.
6 years after the Pilgrims, a group of Puritans came to Salem to found the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And then in 1630, another group came to found Boston. At Salem, the colonists soon built substantial homes. The Galt Pickman House dates from 1636. The Puritans did not want to separate from the English church like the Pilgrims did. They wanted to purify it from within. And they came here to found a pure, new society. Another early home was built by Roger Williams in 1634. Roger Williams was minister of the Salem church, but his religious ideas were too radical for the Puritans. He barely escaped arrest and fled south to found the new colony of Rhode Island. His house today is famous as the Salem Witch House. Then, in 1630, 1,000 more Puritans came, led by John Winthrop, to found Boston as a part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, the Puritans were interested in religious toleration for themselves, but not for anyone else. Anne Hutchinson was a Puritan with religious ideas of her own. She was tried for heresy in 1637, and she and her followers were banished from Boston. They went south down to the new colony of Rhode Island. Mary Dyer was a Quaker. The Quakers were not tolerated either by the Pilgrims or the Puritans. Mary Dyer was hanged in Boston for her beliefs. Another early effort to keep out heresy was Harvard College. Just 10 years after they had arrived, the Massachusetts Bay colonists founded the college to train Puritan ministers. Harvard was established to prevent controversial thinking and maintain the purity of their religious beliefs. But so many non-Puritan settlers were coming to the colony that the Puritans soon lost their grip. Among these were the French Huguenots, fleeing persecution in France. One of these Huguenots was Peter Funnel. He built Funnel Hall in Boston, and then he donated it to the city, and its grasshopper weather vane soon became a symbol for the city. Another Huguenot was Apollo Rivoire, whose unpronounceable French name soon became Paul Revere. Apollo's son is the Paul Revere that we know. Paul Revere the son bought this house in North Square in 1770. He lived here through the Revolution with his family. Paul had 2 wives and 16 children and outlived all but 5 of them. During his long life of 84 years, Paul engaged in a number of trades. Among them were engraving, making and setting false teeth, hardware dealer, but his principal occupation was that of silversmith. And the simple style that Paul created 200 years ago is still popular today. Paul put his engraving to work, protesting actions of the Crown against the colonies. His engraving of the Boston Massacre is famous. On March 5th, 1770, a crowd was harassing a group of British soldiers in front of the old State House. Tensions had been rising for the last year and a half, since the troops had been quartered here in Boston to protect the king's tax collectors. Tempers flared. Shots rang out. 5 people lay dead and dying. They were buried here in the old granary burying ground. The first to fall was a black man, Crispus Attucks. This single headstone marks their resting place. On December 16th, 1773, Paul was among the group that gathered here at South Meeting House to protest the actions of Parliament in granting a tea monopoly to the British East India Company. Paul was with the crowd that marched that night on Griffin's Wharf, dressed as Indians, where they tossed tea into the harbor from 3 ships. Today, tourists can relive the Boston Tea Party at the Tea Party Museum on Griffin's Wharf, photographing one another as they toss bales of tea into the harbor. Students from Bacchus Junior High School in Washington, D.C. enjoy it even in the rain. Now, listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. British troops were preparing to march in secret from Boston out to Concord to seize guns and powder that had been concealed there by the colonists. But Paul Revere, at North Church, having learned of their plans, arranged for the sexton to hang signal lanterns in the belfry. As Longfellow relates it in his poem, 1 if by land, and 2 if by sea. And I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. Revere reached Lexington about midnight and went to Buckman's Tavern, where Minutemen gathered through the night. At dawn, on Lexington Green, 77 Minutemen faced an arriving force of 700 British regulars. Who fired the first single shot is not known, but 2 British volleys rang out and 8 Minutemen were killed. The British troops then marched off down the road towards Concord. One group of them separated and went to North Bridge, where they met a large and determined force of Minutemen. In the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson, "By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here, once, the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world." The British troops hastened back to Concord, where they began their retreat to Charlestown. By now, hundreds of Minutemen were pouring in from the countryside toward the retreat road. At Miriam's Corners, 1,000 Minutemen gathered in the shelter of Miriam's house and barns. And as the British troops marched by down the road, the British rear guard turned and fired back at the Minutemen, thus starting the running battle that would last all the way to Charlestown. The Minutemen fired at the retreating troops along the road, now known as the Battle Road, from behind trees and from behind houses and from behind rocks. The American Revolution was on. After the Revolution, Paul Revere set up a foundry to cast bells. Manufacturing had been prohibited in the colonies, but now it could flourish. Paul cast the last, the largest, and the best of his bells for King's Chapel, where it still tolls today. King's Chapel was the Anglican church of colonial Boston. When the priest fled with the Tories, he took the silver communion service with him. After the Revolution, King's Chapel became the first Unitarian church of Boston, and Paul Revere was commissioned to make a new silver communion service for the church. The dome of the new State House is gilded today, but for the first 60 years of its life, it was sheathed in copper, rolled by Paul Revere in the first copper rolling mill in the country. The first cotton spinning mill in the country was established in 1790 by Samuel Slater in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. That was about 8 years before Paul Revere set up his copper rolling mill. Samuel Slater is considered to be the father of the American Industrial Revolution. But it was in the textile mills of Lowell, Massachusetts, where large-scale, integrated mass production really began. At Lowell, they started with raw cotton and ended with finished cloth. It was the water power of the Merrimack River that attracted a group of investors in 1822 to begin building a maze of mills at Lowell, and a cluster of canals to deliver water to power the looms, and Lowell prospered for the next 100 years. Young women from farms from all around the country swarmed to Lowell to work in the mills. Today, park ranger Erin Enright plays the role of one of those 19th century mill girls, Sarah Page, Both a state and a national park celebrate Lowell's contribution to the Industrial Revolution. And now, mill girl Sarah Page tells us about coming to Lowell.
Well, I got there, and never such a tangle of masonry did I ever find as the city of Lowell. Buildings of brick stretching in every direction, no matter where the eye could look. I lived in a boarding house, lived with other girls from Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont, girls even from Connecticut and Rhode Island. I shared my bed with another girl. First bells would ring to wake us up in the morning at 4:30. And we would get up and out of bed. I remember we would dress ourselves by the light of a candle, and then get downstairs to eat our breakfast, which usually consisted of coffee and some breads and maybe some cold meats left over from the previous evening's supper. We'd have to do this all might fast, because we'd have to be at our looms in the mill at 5 o'clock in the morning when the second bell would ring. Words can't describe exactly what the conditions were like working in them mills, working on the floors with the looms. And the noise of the mills and the looms were so loud that you could not hear a girl speak, not even if she stood next to you and screamed at the top of her lungs.
An elaborate system of belts, pulleys, and shafts delivered power to the individual looms. A huge flywheel drove the main power distribution shaft up there by the ceiling. This flywheel, in turn, was connected to the water-powered turbine through a large bevel gear. Here, one of the turbines has been pulled up out of the water so we can see what it looks like. There's a model of a turbine here at Lowell that shows how they work. The water flowed in from the sides and hit those vanes, causing the turbine to rotate. Then the water flowed on into the center of the turbine and down, out through the bottom. But George Corliss, in 1849, patented a valve system for steam engines that foreshadowed the end of water as an industrial power source. Corliss valve proved so efficient that it was called the greatest advance in steam power since James Watt, and new mill installations began to use steam, which was also more reliable than water. This 90-ton, 600-horsepower Corliss engine, now in the Owl's Head Museum in Maine, once powered textile printing presses in Cranston, Rhode Island. Corliss manufactured his steam engines in Providence, Rhode Island. Providence, where, in 1636, Roger Williams came to found a haven of religious toleration. Williams wrote, "Having a sense of God's merciful providence unto me in my distress, I called the place Providence." Then, in 1638, Anne Hutchinson and her followers came down from Boston to found Portsmouth, and a year later, a group of them went down to found Newport. Rhode Island was the first colony to have true religious freedom. The First Baptist Church was founded by Roger Williams himself in 1636. The present building dates from 1775. Quakers, who were often put to death for their beliefs, found refuge in Rhode Island. This Quaker meeting house in Portsmouth is over almost 300 years old. The oldest Jewish synagogue in the nation is in Newport, and the Catholics came in the 18th century. Today, in the capital city, Providence, many of the old buildings have been carefully preserved. Stephen Hopkins was a Quaker, 10 times colonial governor, signer of the Declaration of Independence. He lived in this house in Providence. There were 4 Brown brothers who were prominent in Rhode Island in the late 1700s. John Brown, wealthy merchant, lived in this house designed by his architect brother Joseph. Moses Brown financed the Slater Mill, and Nicholas Brown was the benefactor of Brown University. The man who gave his name to sideburns lived in this house in Providence, Civil War General Ambrose Burnside. The most prominent city in Rhode Island was Newport before the Revolution, but a long occupation by the British completely destroyed its economy, And Newport did not recover its former glory until the latter half of the 19th century, when wealthy industrialists from New York and elsewhere turned it into a summer playground. Today, from the Cliff Walk, tourists can peer at some of these elegant summer cottages like Cornelius Vanderbilt's Breakers. 9 of these mansions have been restored and are open to the public. Marble House was designed by architect William Morris Hunt in 1892 for William Vanderbilt, brother of Cornelius. Rosecliff was designed by Stanford White in 1902 for the daughter of the man who discovered the Comstock lode in Nevada. At Beechwood, the home of Mrs. William Astor, the tour guides are actors, playing the role of house guests at a 19th century house party. Carolyn Astor, known as the Mrs. Astor, was the originator of the idea of the 400 socially elite of New York City, because her ballroom in New York City would hold just 400 people. The actor guides conduct visitors through the rooms of the house, and occasionally they will play out a little vignette for the benefit of the visitors. Here, a maid has been caught eavesdropping at the keyhole. The ballroom would be the focal point of the house party, and in 1895, Mrs. Astor had the largest ballroom in Newport. These wall decorations in the ballroom are supposed to depict scenes from Greek mythology. Adjacent to the ballroom, in the dining room, over the mantelpiece, is a portrait of the founder of the family fortune, John Jacob Astor, the Beaver King. Today, Newport is a yachting center, and on a Sunday afternoon, yachts will sail, and down at Brenton Point State Park, people will come for kite flying. $185 million years ago, dinosaurs roamed the land where now the Connecticut River flows. Today, at Dinosaur State Park, people come to make plaster casts of the petrified tracks of these prehistoric monsters. Scientists believe that these tracks were made by a relative of the Dilophosaurus dinosaur, whose bones have been found in the Southwest, although no bones have actually been found in Connecticut. The first step in making the plaster cast is to oil the petrified track. In 1633, colonists began moving west from the coast into Connecticut. They settled in Windsor, Wethersfield, Hartford, Saybrook, and New Haven. In 1633, a group of settlers from Plymouth sailed up the Connecticut River. They bought land from the Indians to establish the town of Windsor. Today, near the Founders' Monument at the edge of the green, is the Filer House, built in 1640. It houses an historical museum and a genealogical library. The next year, 10 settlers came overland from the Massachusetts Bay Colony and founded the town of Wethersfield. In Wethersfield, in the Webb House, General George Washington and General Rochambeau planned the Yorktown campaign that ended the Revolution. The next settlement was down at the mouth of the Connecticut River in 1635. The name Connecticut comes from an Indian word that means long tidal river. Overlooking the Connecticut River, the English built a fort to found the town of Saybrook. Their charter from the king granted them the right to settle a tract of land from the Narragansett River to the Pacific Ocean. The first governor of the colony was Lyon Gardner. He designed the fort and lived in it with his wife. Saybrook's collegiate school, chartered in 1701, was moved in 1716 to New Haven Green and renamed Yale College, today Yale University. Well, there are no buildings left here from 1716. In fact, the oldest building on the campus today is Connecticut Hall, built in 1752. Nathan Hale lived in Connecticut Hall. Nathan Hale graduated from Yale at the age of 18 in 1773, and 3 years later, in 1776, he was hanged by the British as a spy, saying, "I regret that I have but one life to give for my country." After the Revolution, fishing, whaling, and shipping became dominant in the coastal commerce of New England, and at Mystic Seaport, in Connecticut, New England's maritime history is preserved in a reconstructed 19th century seacoast village. Over the course of more than 60 years, buildings, watercraft, and maritime collections have been assembled here to create a living museum. There are over 300 watercraft at Mystic, like these whale boats, which were lowered from the whaling ship to go chase the whales. The Charles W. Morgan is the only surviving wooden whaling ship in the country, and on the deck of the Morgan is the brick try-works, where blubber was melted down into oil. Also at Mystic is the fishing schooner, the L.A. Dunton. On the deck of the Dunton, the fishing dories are stacked up. And then there's the training ship, Joseph Conrad, built in Denmark and used today here at Mystic to train young sailors. And it was on ships such as these that men sailed to sea and sang of home.
Home, dearie home, and it's home I want to be. My topsails are hoisted and I'm bound to sea. The oak and the ash and the bonny birchen tree are all growing green in the north country. And it's home, dearie home.
35 miles up the Connecticut River from Long Island Sound, a ferry has been carrying people, animals, and vehicles across the Connecticut River every year since 1655. The Rocky Hill Glastonbury Ferry is the oldest continuously operating ferry in the country. Eight or 10 more miles up the river is the insurance capital of the nation, Hartford. In 1835, a huge fire in New York City destroyed 600 buildings, bankrupting many insurance companies. But the Hartford Fire Insurance Company paid all its claims, thus establishing Hartford's reputation for insurance. The gold dome of the state capitol stands atop a Victorian fantasy of a building in Bushnell Park. And in another Victorian fantasy of a building, with a high porch, like the pilot house of a Mississippi riverboat, Mark Twain spent the 25 most productive years of his life. It was in this house that he wrote 7 of his most famous works, among them Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. The meanders of the Connecticut River twist across the Pioneer Valley of Massachusetts. Over on the west bank is Northampton with Smith College, and to the north, the towers of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst glint in the sun. The Pioneer Valley is the most productive agricultural region in Massachusetts. To the north, the Connecticut River divides Vermont and New Hampshire. In 1750, in the unoccupied territory that would become Vermont, New Hampshire's governor suddenly began granting land to settlers from New Hampshire. Governor Benning Wentworth had granted 3 million acres by 1764. Then, in 1765, New York, which really had a better claim to the territory, began surveying and granting the same land to settlers from New York. Well, the New Hampshireites weren't about to put up with this kind of nonsense. So Ethan Allen and his brother Ira founded the Green Mountain Boys to chase out those New York surveyors and settlers, and their scare tactics were very successful. They took their name from the Green Mountains of Vermont. Then, when the Revolution came along, the Continental Congress sided with New York. So Vermont, in 1777, in this house in Windsor, declared itself an independent republic. They even thought of joining Canada. But finally, in 1791, Vermont became the 14th of the United States of America. From Windsor, we'll wander Vermont, stopping at Middlebury, Woodstock, Peacham, Randolph, and Killington. Spanning the Connecticut River at Windsor is the longest covered bridge in the country, 460 feet long. This bridge was built in 1866. It's been recently remodeled. There are over 100 covered bridges in Vermont. These timber bridges were covered to protect the underlying structure from weather and rot. The oldest covered bridge in Vermont is at Middlebury, the Pulp Mill Bridge, built between 1808 and 1820. And it's the only 2-lane covered bridge on a public highway in Vermont. These covered bridges were built as high and as wide as a load of hay, and strong enough to drive a herd of cattle across. The strength of the bridge is in the truss. The most popular truss was the Town Lattice Truss, patented by Ithiel Town in 1820. About 2/3 of Vermont's covered bridges use Town's truss. At each crossing of the truss, the structure is reinforced with 2 trunnels, spelled tree nail, large round pegs of oak. Another Town Lattice Truss bridge is at Woodstock, but this one was built in 1969. The center of Woodstock's charm is its village green. Surrounding the village green is a showcase of Federal-style houses, carefully preserved. The White House there is Richard's Tavern. That's the oldest of the Woodstock houses. It was built in 1776. But all of these houses around the green date from the late 1700s and early 1800s. In the fall, tourists swarm to Vermont. Called leaf peepers, they're here for the annual display of nature's magnificence. nestled in the mountains above Middlebury, is the breadloaf campus of Middlebury College. Here, the poet Robert Frost taught for 23 summers until his death in 1962. Frost lived in this farmhouse near the campus, and he did his writing in this secluded cabin. Nearby is the Robert Frost Interpretive Trail, dedicated in 1976. It wanders through woods and meadows, and at intervals along the trail are plaques with Frost's poems. At the head of the trail is a poem that begins, "As I came to the edge of the woods, thrush music, hark!" Almost like a call to come in. And another Frost poem. There's a place called Faraway Meadow we never shall mow in again. Then, now is the chance for the flowers that can't stand mowers and plowers. It must be now, though, in season, before the not mowing brings trees on, before trees, seeing the opening, march into a shadowy claim. And heaven gives its glimpses only to those not in position to look too close. Up in Vermont's northeast kingdom, in the little town of Peacham, population about 500, on the Thursday of Fall Color Week, at the Congregational Church, a New England boiled dinner is served to some 500 visiting leaf peepers. This dinner is put on by the members of the Bailey Hazen Snowmobile Club. The women work all the day before preparing the vegetables, and in the evening the men come in to cut the hams. The chief cook is Emile Berard. And every year, Stacia Livingstone comes all the way up from Stonington, Connecticut, just to cut the pies. Pauline Berard has been managing this dinner now for 12 years. This year's club president is Frank Berwick. And now the food is all ready, so let the people come in. The tables are all full for the first sitting, so people waiting for the second sitting are upstairs in the church singing hymns. The cordwood is piling up to last people through the long Vermont winters with their wood stoves. Here, at Randolph, Vermont, Duncan Syme makes wood stoves. Duncan Syme was an architect designing solar-heated houses, and his customers wanted wood stoves for the cloudy days. But Duncan couldn't find any stoves that satisfied him, so he and his partner established Vermont Castings to design and make wood stoves. It all starts with molten iron. The liquid metal is poured into sand molds to cast the individual stove parts. And at the end of the casting line, the stove parts come out, shaken free of the sand from the molds. Parts are sprayed with a white undercoat. Then, after that undercoat has cured, they will be coated with a colored enamel. At this time of year, winter can come any time. New England's mountains are scattered with ski slopes. Vermont alone has over 17 of them. The largest is Killington. Killington has the largest snowmaking capacity in the world, 40 miles of trails. Water, pumped from ponds like this, and compressed air, delivered by a phalanx of diesel-driven compressors, is combined in nozzles aligned along the slopes to make snow. The slopes close at 4 p.m. and the snow grooming machines move out to prepare the snow for the next day's skiing. Our driver this evening is Kevin. Kevin has spent the last 3 years driving machines like this in Jackson Hole. The snow grooming machines work all night long, and as the first rosy fingers of dawn highlight the snow-making sprays at the summit, sunlight glints off the windshields of the snow grooming machines still hard at work. As winter wanes, sap buckets appear in the land. But the modern way to collect maple sap is to connect plastic food-grade tubing directly to the trees. Then this purple and green tubing is run through the forest to a central collection point carrying the sap. Sometimes that collection point is just a bucket in the woods, but sometimes the plastic tubing can be run directly from the tree all the way right straight into the sugar house. South Face Farm in Ashfield, Massachusetts is owned by Tom McCrum. Tom makes about 1,000 gallons of maple syrup a year, and Tom's first step is high-tech. With this machine, known as a reverse osmosis unit, Tom can remove about 2/3 of the water from the sap. Then the concentrate from the reverse osmosis machine goes to the evaporator, where the traditional sap boiling takes place. Maple sap is about 2% sugar, but maple syrup is 66% sugar. 98% of the water has to be removed from the sap. It takes 43 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. Tom checks the sugar content of his syrup to make sure it's ready to be bottled. And every weekend during maple syrup season, pancake breakfasts are served in the sugar house with lots of maple syrup. Along the Connecticut River, spring arrives. At Vernon, about 3 miles north of the Massachusetts border, is the first power dam built by the New England Power Company on the Connecticut River. This dam began operating in 1909, and around the dam is a fish ladder for the spring spawning migration of the salmon and shad. These adult shad average about 5 pounds and are about 18 inches long. Shad generally spawn only in the lower part of the river, so they don't go upstream much farther than about Bellows Falls, about 40 miles north of the Vernon Dam. Then, 200 miles north of Bellows Falls, the Connecticut River veers east into New Hampshire, and 400 miles from its mouth, the Connecticut River is just a slim stream beaded by 4 lakes called imaginatively First Connecticut Lake, Second Connecticut Lake, Third Connecticut Lake. Aha, but to get to the 4th Connecticut Lake, you have to hike for an hour through the brush along the U.S.-Canadian border, and then off into the woods to find the source of the Connecticut River. In the marshy ground around 4th Connecticut Lake, pitcher plants wait for flies to fall into their trap. And there are the headwaters of the Connecticut River. Northern New Hampshire is moose country, and in the spring the moose come down to drink water by the roadsides, water laced with winter's road salt to replace minerals that they have lost during the winter. From the headwaters of the Connecticut River, we'll visit Franconia Notch, Bethlehem, Bretton Woods, and Mount Washington. In Franconia Notch, a valley carved by the Great Wisconsin Glacier, are the granite ledges of New Hampshire's Old Man of the Mountain, made famous in Nathaniel Hawthorne's tale, The Great Stone Face. Nearby, unrelenting stream flow has eroded away lava rock that once separated these tall walls of Conway granite to form the flume. The flume is no more than 20 feet wide and 70 to 90 feet tall. The flume was discovered in 1803 by Aunt Jess Guernsey when she was out on a fishing trip. Aunt Jess was 93 years old. Avalanche Falls tumbles into the flume at its upper end. Near Bethlehem, New Hampshire, Newt Washburn, with the sometime help of his granddaughter Leah, weaves baskets out of brown ash, following a tradition handed down through his family from his Native American great-grandmother. Newt tells us that one of his baskets is in the Smithsonian Institution and shows us the award that he has received from the National Endowment for the Arts. It all starts with a brown ash log. Newt's friend Bob pounds the log to break up the fibers so he can strip off a piece of brown ash. He then breaks the fibers some more so he can split that strip in two. Newt coils up the strips and soaks them in hot water to make them supple enough to weave. Then he slits the split strips using tools of his own making. Then he splits that slit strip in two once more and planes it smooth on his knee with a penknife. He makes the base of the basket over a special form that he's devised, and that star pattern in the bottom of the basket is kind of a Washburn family trademark. He reinforces the top of the basket before he puts the handle on. Then the handle will be held on by that strip that he's now placing around the outside of the basket. It fits right into a pair of notches in the handle. Everything in this basket, including that lacing, is made of brown ash. At the foot of Mount Washington in August 1902, an elegant new resort hotel opened its doors at Bretton Woods. No expense was spared on the Mount Washington Hotel. In July 1944, the famous Bretton Woods Monetary Conference convened here to work out post-war monetary policy and establish currency exchange rates. The delegates met in the Gold Room, where they hammered out an agreement that would serve the world for the next 25 years. High on the slope of Mount Washington, a plume of black smoke signals another ascent of the Mount Washington Cog Railway. Since 1869, this little railroad has been carrying sightseers up to the summit of New England's highest peak. The principles, if not the practice, of the Mountain Cog Railway were already known when Sylvester Marsh began developing his railroad here in the 1850s. A heavy gear-driven cog-wheel meshes with a rack that runs right up the center of the track, and in this way, the little engine can pull itself up the mountainside. This trip, at a speed of no more than 4 miles an hour, will use 1,000 gallons of water and burn a ton of coal. From up on top, on a clear day, you can look out over the Presidential Range, Mount Jefferson, Mount Adams, Mount Madison. But the weather up here can change quickly, and keeping track of all those weather changes is the Mount Washington Observatory, a private, non-profit corporation. The Mount Washington Observatory works 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And it was here, on April 12th, 1934, that the highest wind velocity ever recorded on the surface of the Earth was measured, 231 miles an hour. Matt Wolf, there on the left, shows us another recording of some more recent winds of velocities of over 170 miles an hour. To the east of us, 15 miles as the crow flies, lies the state of Maine. In Maine, we will pass by the Rangeley Lakes on our way to Kingfield, Maine. Then we'll go on to Acadia National Park and then to Rockport and Camden. Mooslemaguntic Lake, with Toothaker Island in the middle, is part of a chain of lakes that takes its name from this lake, Rangeley Lake. Off in the distance are the Bigelow Mountains. Another view of the Bigelow Mountains from Sugarloaf Mountain. Steam car enthusiasts from all over the continent are converging on Kingfield, Maine for their annual steam car rally. Kingfield is the birthplace of the Stanley brothers, Freeland Oscar and Francis Edgar, developers and manufacturers of the famous Stanley steamer. Freel and Frank were identical twins, but Frank always wore a stick pin in his necktie so that their secretary would know whose name to put on the letters. Their first business was manufacturing photographic plates, but they sold that business to George Eastman, leaving them both money and time to devote to their steam car business. Kingfield is also the site of the Stanley Museum, housed in a building designed by the brothers as a school, but now converted into a museum. Sitting in a 1905 Stanley steamer is Susan Davis, director of the museum. Susan is going to fire up a Stanley steamer for us. Now, the first thing she has to do is pump up pressure in the fuel tank for the pilot light. Now, that's a little bit like pumping up a Coleman stove. Then she checks the boiler and drains some of the water out of the boiler to make room for the steam that will be generated. Next, she heats up all the pipes and nozzles for the burner so that when the cold fuel comes in from the tank, it can vaporize and burn. And then she opens the main valve and the burner ignites. Now, while the steam is building up in the tank, she has to keep pumping up pressure in the main fuel tank. But once the car is rolling, that will be done automatically. But before we can take a drive, Susan first has to roll the car back and forth several feet to get rid of any water that might have condensed in the cylinders. And then we're ready to go. And now, on to the coast. The coast of Maine has many moods. bird watches bird watchers in Acadia National Park at Otter Point. The Otter Cliffs are the highest headland on the Atlantic coast north of Rio de Janeiro, 110 feet high. And inland from Otter Point is the dominant feature of the park, Cadillac Mountain, 1,530 feet high. Looking out across Bar Harbor at the Porcupine Islands in Frenchman Bay. Now we're looking back down on Otter Point, and now out across Seal Harbor at the Cranberry Islands. Now the fog rolls back into Frenchman Bay, shrouding the Porcupine Islands. Along the coast, lobstermen ply their trade. In Southwest Harbor, on the fringes of Acadia Park at Beale's Lobster Pier, the lobstermen arrive to deliver their daily catch. East of Acadia Park are Rockport and Camden. In Rockport, down by the mouth of the harbor, is the Rockport Apprentice Shop. Here, young craftsmen from all over the world come to spend 2 years learning the ancient art of making wooden boats. On a dark and drizzly June day, a crowd is gathered to celebrate the launching of a Buzzards Bay sloop, made here at the Apprentice Shop for Jim Brown, former editor of Down East magazine. Larry Murray and Elise Brown are the two apprentices who have devoted their energy and skill to crafting this fair vessel. Just north of Rockport is Camden, and out of Camden's harbor sails a large part of Maine's Windjammer fleet. Ships like the Mary Day, the Roseway, the Appledore, The Appledore, owned by John McKean, sails several times a day out of Camden's harbor for cruises of 2 to 3 hours on Penobscot Bay. Other ships sail for a day or 3 days or a week, but whatever the duration, a sailing adventure in a wooden ship with the wind and the salt spray can carry you back to the very origins of our nation.